Get her away from my son. The words cracked through the polished dining room like a dropped glass, sharp enough to slice through every quiet conversation and clink of silverware. And for a split second, everything froze. The waitstaff mid-step, a fork suspended halfway to a mouth, the low hum of jazz slipping into an awkward silence as all eyes turned toward the corner table where a small boy's cries trembled against the high ceilings, thin and desperate, like he was trying to outrun something no one else could see. And, standing just a few feet away, Ava Brooks felt it hit her chest. That sound, not loud but piercing, the kind that didn't belong in a place where entrees cost more than her weekly paycheck, and people spoke in controlled tones, the kind that reminded her of nights she had buried deep under years of learning to keep moving, to keep smiling, to keep invisible. Her tray felt heavier in her hands now, the condensation from a glass of iced water slipping down her fingers, cold against her skin, grounding her in a moment that was quickly unraveling, because the boy, no older than 7, was rocking in his chair, his small hands pressed tight against his ears, his face twisted in a panic that didn't match the calm authority of the man beside him. Ethan Caldwell, a name whispered in financial magazines and business channels, a man who built empires with precision but now stood rigid, jaw clenched, eyes sharp with something closer to frustration than understanding, his tailored suit catching the warm overhead light while his son seemed to shrink beneath it. And Ava could see it clearly, the way no one else at that table did. Not the well-dressed woman reaching awkwardly for a napkin, not the manager already stepping forward with a forced smile that masked urgency, not the other diners shifting in their seats, uncomfortable, impatient, judging. Ava's breath slowed, 1 count in, 1 count out, the world narrowing not to the room, not to the billionaire, but to the boys. Uneven rhythm, the subtle tremor in his shoulders, the way his foot tapped against the chair leg in a pattern that wasn't random but searching, always searching for something steady, and she knew that pattern, knew it in the quiet places of her memory where her younger brother's laughter and silence still lived side by side, knew what it meant when noise became too much, when touch felt like fire, when the world closed in without warning, and for a moment she didn't move, because she wasn't supposed to, because she was just a waitress in a pressed black uniform standing in a room that reminded her, with every glance and whispered word, exactly where she stood. But then the boy let out another sharp cry, louder this time, and it cut through every rule she had learned to follow, every boundary she had been told not to cross, and her fingers loosened around the tray, the glassware settling with a soft clink as she placed it down on the nearest empty table. The polished wood cool beneath her palm, and without asking, without announcing herself, she took a step forward, then another, her shoes quiet against the floor, her presence small but deliberate, as if she were walking into a space that had been waiting for her all along, even if no one else in that room believed she belonged there. Ava could feel every pair of eyes following her, not loud, not confrontational, just present, heavy in that quiet way that reminded her exactly how visible she had suddenly become in a room where she was never meant to be seen. And yet she kept moving, each step measured, controlled, as if the distance between her and the boy was something fragile that could break if she rushed it. The soft glow of the overhead lights catching the edges of her uniform, while the faint scent of grilled steak and expensive cologne hung in the air, unchanged, indifferent. And somewhere behind her she heard the manager's voice, low but urgent, calling her name in a warning tone that did not need to be loud to carry authority. But she did not turn, because turning meant stopping, and stopping meant leaving the boy alone in that rising storm inside him. And she knew better than that. She had always known better than that. Her hands stayed open at her sides, fingers relaxed, shoulders lowered, every movement intentional, because she remembered what sudden motion could do, how it could make everything worse, how it could turn fear into something sharper, something uncontrollable. And as she drew closer, she lowered herself slightly, not enough to draw attention, just enough to soften her presence, to make herself smaller, less threatening, the way she used to do in a small apartment years ago where the walls were thin and the nights were long and filled with sounds no one else understood. And the memory brushed past her like a shadow, quick but grounding, guiding her instincts more than any training ever could. Liam's cries did not stop. But Ava noticed the rhythm shifting, the pauses between them stretching just a fraction longer. The way his fingers tightened and loosened as if searching for something steady, something predictable, and she matched it, not with words, not yet, but with her breathing, slow and even, a quiet pattern offered without demand, her eyes soft, focused not on controlling him but on being there, simply there, and she stopped a few feet away, careful not to cross that invisible boundary that only he could define, her knees bending slightly as she lowered herself further, bringing her line of sight closer to his without forcing it, the polished floor cool beneath her shoes, grounding her in place. Behind Liam, Ethan shifted, his presence sharp and restless, the kind of energy that filled a room even in silence, and Ava could feel it without looking, the tension, the expectation that she would step back, apologize, disappear, because that was what someone in her position was supposed to do. And for a brief second the weight of that expectation pressed against her chest. The years of being told to stay in her place, to not interfere, to not overstep, echoing quietly in her mind. But then Liam let out another broken sound, softer this time, and it cut through everything else, leaving only what mattered, and Ava exhaled slowly, her voice finally emerging, not loud, not commanding, just steady, just present, a gentle thread in the noise. Hey, it is okay, she said, the words simple, chosen carefully, offered without pressure, and she kept her distance, her hands still visible, her posture open, giving him space to decide, to feel, to come back in his own time. And for the first time since she stepped forward, she allowed herself to fully focus on him, not the room, not the billionaire, not the consequences waiting behind her, just the boy in front of her and the fragile moment hanging between them, quiet, uncertain, but not impossible. The room did not breathe again, not fully, but something shifted, subtle enough that most would miss it. Except Ava felt it immediately in the way the boy's shoulders no longer jerked as sharply, in the slight hesitation between each cry, like a storm losing its rhythm, and she held on to that fragile change with quiet precision, not moving closer, not reaching out, just staying exactly where she was, as if the space between them was part of the solution itself, her voice low and steady as she repeated, "You are okay. I am right here," not expecting him to respond, not asking anything of him, only offering a presence that did not demand control. And for a moment it seemed like nothing else mattered, not the polished marble floors, not the dozens of eyes watching, not even the man standing behind the boy whose silence now carried more weight than his earlier command. Ethan Caldwell stood still, but not in the same rigid certainty as before, his posture unchanged, yet something beneath it unsettled, his gaze fixed on Ava with a sharpness that was no longer just authority but calculation, disbelief, and something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time, because he had seen specialists, therapists, people with degrees framed on walls and language filled with technical explanations, and none of them had ever managed to reach his son in the middle of a moment like this without escalating it further. And yet here was a waitress, someone he had dismissed without a second thought, kneeling a few feet away and somehow altering the atmosphere without touching a single thing. A quiet murmur rippled through a nearby table, quickly hushed, the kind of restrained curiosity that came from witnessing something that did not fit expectations, and Ava remained focused, her breathing unchanged, her hands still open and visible, allowing Liam to notice them if he wanted, to ignore them if he needed, giving him the freedom to choose, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, his hands lowered from his ears, not all the way, but enough to reveal his face, flushed and damp, his eyes darting at first, searching for something familiar in a space that had overwhelmed him, until they landed on her, and stayed there just a second longer than before. Ava did not smile too widely, did not react with excitement. She only softened her gaze, grounding it in calm reassurance. And she shifted her hand slightly, drawing a small, simple motion in the air, slow enough to be understood without words, a gesture she had not used in years but remembered with clarity, a silent signal that meant safe, and she held it there for a beat, then lowered it, repeating the motion again, consistent, predictable, offering him a pattern he could follow if he chose to. And Liam's breathing changed, still uneven but no longer sharp, the sound thinning out, losing its edge, Until what? Filled the space between them was not silence yet, but something close, something approaching it. Behind him, Ethan took a step forward, then stopped himself, as if uncertain whether moving would break whatever was happening. His control meeting a moment he could not command, and for the first time since the outburst began, he did not speak, did not interrupt, he simply watched, his expression tightening not with anger but with realization, because he was beginning to understand that this was not about authority, not about instructions or discipline, but something else entirely, something he had overlooked, and Ava, still kneeling, still steady, felt the shift without needing to look, because the room itself had changed, the tension no longer pressing down but hovering, waiting, as if everyone present knew they were witnessing a moment that could not be forced, only allowed to unfold. The distance between them held, delicate and precise, as if even the air understood it should not rush in too quickly, and Ava kept her movement slow, almost invisible, her focus anchored entirely on Liam's breathing, on the subtle rise and fall of his chest that had begun to steady, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to signal a shift that mattered, and she mirrored it again, drawing in a breath through her nose, letting it out gently through parted lips, a quiet rhythm offered without instruction, her voice barely above a whisper as she repeated, "You are doing okay, just breathe." The words soft enough to blend into the room rather than disrupt it, and Liam's eyes, still glossy with leftover fear, flickered between her face and her hands, searching, testing, deciding whether this calm was something he could trust. And Ava did not rush him, did not reach forward. She only adjusted slightly, lowering herself another inch so she was no longer above him at all but level, equal, her posture open, her presence steady, and she traced that same small motion again, slow and deliberate, a pattern that asked nothing but offered consistency. And this time Liam's gaze followed it more closely, his fingers loosening from their tight curl, resting now against the edge of the chair, instead of pressing against his ears, and the sound he made was no longer a sharp cry but a softer, uneven breath that gradually found its way into the rhythm she had been holding for him. Behind them, the room seemed to lean in without moving, the silence no longer tense but suspended, as if everyone understood that speaking too loudly or stepping too suddenly might unravel something fragile that was finally beginning to settle. And Ethan stood there, his hands no longer clenched at his sides, his shoulders slightly lowered though he had not realized it yet, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding in front of him with a kind of focus he reserved only for moments that mattered, because this was something he had never seen before, not in his home, not in sterile offices with controlled lighting and measured voices, not in reports or progress charts. This was raw and quiet and real, and it was happening without instruction, without force, guided only by a woman he had dismissed as irrelevant minutes ago. Ava felt the shift deepen, the air around Liam no longer charged with panic but easing into something softer, something closer to stillness, and she allowed a slight pause in her motion, giving him space to lead, to come forward in his own way if he chose to, her eyes never leaving his, not intense, not demanding, just present. And for a moment that seemed to stretch longer than it should, nothing happened, the kind of nothing that felt full rather than empty, until Liam's hand moved, slow and uncertain, lifting just slightly from the chair, as if testing the space between them, and Ava did not react, did not close the distance. She simply stayed where she was, offering him the control he had been missing, and the room held its breath again, not out of tension now, but anticipation, because whatever came next did not belong to authority or expectation, it belonged entirely to him. And for the first time since the moment began, the outcome was no longer defined by fear, but by possibility. Liam's hand hovered in the space between them, small and uncertain, trembling not from fear anymore, but from the effort of choosing, and Ava felt the weight of that moment settle deeper into her chest, because she understood what it meant, not just a movement, not just a gesture, but trust beginning to take shape where panic had been, and she did not reach out to meet him, did not close the gap, even though every instinct in her wanted to reassure him faster, to ease the distance, but she held. Still, grounded in the knowledge that this had to be his step, his pace, his control, and the seconds stretched, quiet and fragile, until his fingers lowered slightly, brushing against the edge of the table as if reconsidering, as if the world beyond his own space still felt too large, too unpredictable, and for a brief moment the rhythm faltered, his breathing catching again, not as sharp as before, but enough to shift the air. And Ava adjusted instantly, not with urgency, but with calm precision, drawing in another slow breath, exaggerating the motion just enough for him to see, to follow if he wanted, her voice soft but steady. That is it, just like that, reinforcing the pattern without pressure, without expectation, and the subtle tension in his shoulders eased again, not disappearing but loosening, allowing the moment to continue rather than collapse. Behind them, a chair shifted slightly, a quiet scrape against the floor that broke the fragile stillness just enough to remind the room of its presence. And Ava felt it immediately in the way Liam's eyes flickered, his focus wavering for a split second, and she knew how quickly something small could undo everything they had built in these few minutes. So she grounded herself even more, her gaze unwavering, her posture unchanged, offering him something constant to return to, something that did not shift or surprise him, and slowly, carefully, his attention came back to her, settling again into that narrow space where the world felt manageable. Ethan watched all of it unfold, every micro-movement, every pause, every adjustment, and the realization that had been building inside him pressed harder now. Because this was not luck, this was not coincidence, this was understanding. Something precise and intentional that he had not been able to replicate no matter how much time or money he had spent, searching for answers. And it unsettled him in a way he could not explain, not because it challenged his authority, but because it revealed a gap he had never been able to fill. And standing there, surrounded by a room that still waited in quiet disbelief, he felt something unfamiliar rise beneath the surface. Not control, not frustration, but something closer to humility, though he would not have named it yet. Ava noticed none of that directly, not in words, not in thoughts, but she felt the shift in the space around her, the absence of interruption, the absence of pressure to stop, and she stayed with Liam, her presence steady, her breathing consistent, her voice a quiet thread that guided without pulling. And after another long second, Liam's hand lifted again, slower this time, more certain, extending just a little farther than before, not reaching for her yet, but no longer pulling away either, and Ava allowed a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging his effort without overwhelming it, giving him permission to continue. And the moment held once more, balance between hesitation and courage, fragile but real, as if the next choice would not just calm him, but change something deeper, something neither of them could fully see yet. The space between Ava and Liam no longer felt fragile in the same way. It felt intentional, like a quiet agreement forming without words, and when his hand extended again it did not hesitate as much, the movement slower but steadier, guided not by panic but by curiosity, and Ava stayed exactly where she was, her body still, her breathing calm, allowing him to cross that invisible line on his own terms. And when his fingers finally brushed against the edge of her hand, it was barely there. A light contact, uncertain, testing, but it was enough to shift everything. Because his shoulders dropped just a fraction more, the tightness in his face easing as if that small connection had anchored him back into the moment. And Ava did not close her hand around his, did not react with surprise or relief. She simply allowed her fingers to remain relaxed, present, a steady point he could hold on to or release whenever he needed. And she whispered softly, "That is it. You are safe." The words, simple, carrying no weight of expectation, just affirmation, and Liam's breathing followed her rhythm now. Uneven still but no longer breaking, no longer spiraling. Each inhale a little deeper, each exhale a little longer, until the sounds of distress that had filled the room only minutes ago faded into something quieter, something manageable, and for the first time his body leaned slightly forward instead of pulling back. The motion small but unmistakable, a shift from defense to trust. The restaurant did not return to normal, not yet, but the silence changed, no longer held by tension but by something softer, something closer to awe, as if the room itself recognized the weight of what had just happened, and Ethan stood there watching, his expression no longer guarded but open in a way that felt unfamiliar even to him. his eyes fixed on the connection between his son and a woman he had not even seen before tonight. And there was no immediate explanation for what he was witnessing. No framework to place it in. Just the undeniable truth unfolding in front of him, that something had reached his son in a way he had not been able to, and it forced him into stillness, not the controlled stillness of authority, but the kind that comes when certainty slips away. Ava remained grounded, her focus still on Liam, not the room, not the man behind him, and she slowly mirrored another breath, deeper this time, guiding him without instructing, her presence steady like a quiet rhythm beneath everything else. And Liam followed, his chest rising more evenly now, his fingers no longer gripping tightly, but resting lightly against her hand, the tension draining from him in small, gradual waves, until the moment that had begun in chaos settled into something almost peaceful, and Ava felt it fully then, that shift from fear into calm, the kind that could not be forced, only reached, and she allowed a slight softness into her expression, not a smile, just a warmth that matched the quiet in his breathing. And for a long second, nothing moved, nothing interrupted, the world narrowing down to a boy who was no longer overwhelmed and a presence that had helped him find his way back. And in that stillness, something deeper changed, not just in Liam, but in the space around them, in the understanding that this moment would not be easily forgotten by anyone who had witnessed it. Ethan did not realize he had taken a step forward until the polished edge of the table brushed lightly against his hand, grounding him in a moment that no longer belonged to control or expectation, but to something quieter, something he could not command. And his eyes remained fixed on Liam, not searching for signs of distress anymore, but for confirmation of what he was seeing. Because his son was no longer retreating into himself, no longer overwhelmed by the invisible weight that had overtaken him just minutes ago. Instead, he was there, present, his small hand resting against Ava's, his breathing steady enough to be heard in the silence, and that alone unsettled everything Ethan thought he understood about the situation. For years he had approached every challenge the same way: identify the problem, bring in experts, apply solutions, measure progress, adjust, repeat. But none of that had prepared him for this, for a moment that could not be structured or controlled, that unfolded not through authority but through patience, through something as simple and as complex as being seen. And he felt it then, not as a thought, but as a realization that settled deeper than logic, that all the time he had been trying to fix what he did not fully understand, he had overlooked something essential, something that could not be forced into place. Ava felt the shift in the space behind her, not through words, but through the absence of resistance, the absence of interruption, and she allowed herself to glance up for the briefest second, meeting Ethan's eyes not with defiance or apology, but with quiet acknowledgement, as if to say that this moment was not about either of them, but about the boy between them. And then she returned her focus to Liam, keeping the rhythm steady, her hand still relaxed beneath his, her presence unchanged, because consistency mattered now more than anything else, and Liam responded to it, his body no longer tense, his shoulders lowered, his gaze no longer darting but settled, anchored in a way that had not been possible before. A faint sound escaped him, not a cry, not distress, but something softer, almost like a breath released after being held too long, and Ava recognized it immediately, the sound of a system coming back into balance, and she nodded slightly, encouraging without overwhelming, letting him know he was doing something right without placing pressure on him to continue. Ethan exhaled, slowly, a breath he had not realized he was holding, and the tightness in his chest eased just enough for him to feel something else rise in its place, something unfamiliar, something that did not fit neatly into the frameworks he relied on. And as he looked at Ava again, really looked this time, he no longer saw just a waitress in a uniform, no longer reduced her to a role or a position. He saw someone who understood something he did not, someone who had stepped into a moment he could not navigate and changed its course without force, without authority, and it left him with a question he had never had to ask before, not out loud, not yet, but present all the same, quiet and persistent, because for the first time, the answer he needed was not something he could buy, and that realization lingered in the stillness, as the room slowly began to breathe again around them. The moment held longer than anyone expected, not because it needed to, but because no one dared to interrupt it, and Ava could feel the quiet settling fully now, not fragile anymore, but stable, something that had taken shape and found its place, and Liam's hand, once hesitant, now rested more naturally against hers, his fingers no longer testing, but simply there, present, grounded, and his breathing had evened out into a soft, steady rhythm that matched the gentle rise and fall of her own, and she allowed a small shift in her posture, not pulling away yet, but easing just enough to signal that he was no longer in the storm he had been caught in, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "You did that. You are okay now," giving him ownership of the calm, reinforcing that it came from him, not from her, and Liam's eyes lifted slightly, meeting hers with a quiet clarity that had not been there before, as if he had returned from somewhere distant and was slowly recognizing the world around him again, behind them. The room began to move, not abruptly, not loudly, but in small, careful ways, a glass set down gently, a chair adjusted without scraping, conversations resuming in hushed tones, as if everyone understood that something important had just passed through the space and deserved respect even in its aftermath, and Ethan stood still in the center of it, no longer the focal point of attention, but somehow more present than before, his gaze shifting from his son to Ava and back again, as if trying to reconcile what he had witnessed with everything he believed about control and capability. And for a moment he said nothing, the silence stretching between them not awkward but heavy with meaning, until he finally stepped closer, slowly, deliberately, careful not to disrupt the balance that had been restored, and his voice, when it came, was lower than before, stripped of the sharp edge it had carried earlier. What did you do?" The question simple, but carrying more than curiosity, carrying a weight of disbelief and something close to humility, and Ava did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because the answer was not something that fit into a single explanation, and instead she glanced at Liam, making sure he remained steady, her hand still beneath his, her presence unchanged, before she spoke softly. "I did not do anything. I just stayed." The words quiet but certain, and Ethan absorbed them in silence, his expression tightening slightly, not in rejection but in realization, because it was not the answer he expected, not a technique, not a method he could replicate on command, but something simpler and more difficult at the same time. And as he looked at his son again, truly looked, he saw what he had missed before, not just the struggle, but the need beneath it, the need to be met where he was instead of pulled somewhere else. And that understanding settled into him slowly, changing the way he stood, the way he breathed, the way he saw the moment that had just unfolded, and Ava, sensing that the moment had reached its natural close, gently shifted her hand, allowing Liam the choice to hold on or let go, her movement slow, respectful, giving him control one last time, and when his fingers loosened without resistance, she rose carefully to her feet, her posture calm, her presence quiet once more, stepping back into a space that now felt different from when she had left it, as if something unseen had shifted not just in one child, but in the people who had watched it happen. The room did not return to what it had been before, not entirely, even as the quiet murmur of conversation slowly rebuilt itself around the edges of the moment, softer now, more careful, as if something invisible still lingered in the air and asked not to be disturbed. And Ava stepped back fully into her role, her movements smooth and practiced, lifting the tray she had set aside earlier, her fingers steady, her posture composed. Yet there was a subtle difference in the way she carried herself. Not louder, not more visible, but grounded in something deeper, something that had already passed and did not need recognition to exist, and she turned slightly toward the service corridor, ready to disappear again into the rhythm of work that rarely paused for anything, when a voice behind her stopped that motion, not sharp, not commanding, but low and deliberate. "Wait." And she paused, not out of obligation, but because the tone carried something unfamiliar, something that did not belong to the authority it had once held. Ethan stood a few feet away now, closer than before, his presence no longer imposing in the same way, his shoulders less rigid, his gaze direct but no longer distant, and for a brief second he seemed to search for something to say, something that matched the weight of what had just happened, but the words did not come easily, not in the language he was used to, not in the certainty he relied on. And so he settled on something simpler, something honest. Thank you. The words quiet, almost restrained, but real, and Ava met his eyes, not surprised, not expecting more, just acknowledging the moment as it was, without extending it, without turning it into something larger than it needed to be, and she gave a small nod, her expression calm, her voice steady as she replied. He did the work, shifting the focus back to Liam, where it belonged, and for a second Ethan looked at her differently again, as if that answer held more meaning than the first, because it removed her from the center even though she had been the one to change everything. And that understanding settled into him in a way that did not require explanation. Behind him, Liam sat quietly now, his hands resting in his lap, his breathing even, his eyes following Ava for a brief moment as she stood there, no longer overwhelmed, no longer lost, just present. And that alone felt like something Ethan could not measure, could not define, but could not ignore. And he turned slightly, glancing back at his son, then forward again, as if the space between those 2 points had shifted in a way he was only beginning to understand. Ava did not wait for anything else, did not linger in the attention or the silence that followed. She simply turned and walked toward the back hallway, her footsteps quiet against the floor, the warm light of the dining room fading gradually behind her as the cooler, dimmer tones of the service corridor took over, the sounds of the restaurant becoming distant, muted, until all that remained was the steady rhythm of her own breathing and the soft hum of the building around her. And for a moment, she paused near the exit door, her hand resting lightly against the metal bar, the cool surface grounding her. The faint reflection of the dining room lights visible in the small glass panel above it, blurred and distant now, and she exhaled slowly, not out of exhaustion, not out of relief, but as a quiet release of the moment that had passed, before pushing the door open and stepping into the night air, where the sound of the city replaced everything else. And behind her, inside a room filled with wealth and quiet conversation, something unseen remained, not spoken, not announced, but felt, in the way a father looked at